All right. Hello. Let's get back into it. So last time we were talking about the 13th Amendment and how even though this amendment was meant to get rid of slavery, we still had Southerners who found a loophole and used both the convict lease system, the black codes, and sharecropping in order to more or less re-enslave freed African Americans. This was referred to as slavery by another name. When we left off last time, we were talking about contracts between sharecroppers and landowners and why these contracts were so bad and why they were not negotiated better in the side of the sharecroppers. Well, this is when education really comes in. So you can go ahead and write underneath where your notes were last time. You can write Reconstruction and then just put education and today's date. So flashback to our last, not our last, but our lecture before last, where we were talking about teachers from the North. All right, quick refresher, we talked about how teachers from the North would follow behind Union armies and they would set up schools at the back of the lines where freed slaves and soldiers would go to get basic skills like reading and writing and, rudimentary math. Okay. Now, if you remember, we had talked about this being the foundation for public school in the South. Okay. So public education continues to be a very big topic, a very heated topic leading into Reconstruction. And so that's what we're going to get into now is the role of education in Reconstruction. All right. So let's get a little bit into it. There are a lot of discussions based around education and the people who are the intellectuals behind education. Okay. And you'll see some of these names again. So, you won't forget them. They'll come up again in later units. But quick review. So we have white people who are very against black education, especially in the South. All right. People in the North don't want black folks educated, but people in the South really do not want black folks educated. Okay. So the question becomes, the question for white people, I should say, is how to educate black and brown people, because this doesn't just apply to African Americans, this applies to a lot of racial minorities. And what will we educate them for? Okay, that might seem like a weird question. Let me back up. Education has a purpose. All right. A very specific purpose, and that purpose changes and evolves over time. Okay. For our current time, education serves as a means to get you being the students, ready to be functional adults in our democracy by the time you graduate high school. That's the basic idea, is that you're supposed to be ready to be a participating, well-rounded citizen by the time you leave high school. Okay. Now we have the extra thing where now we're also trying to prepare everyone for college or for higher education afterwards. But the bare minimum goal of education in the United States today is to prepare you to be a good citizen. Okay. Now, education during Reconstruction, and this is a theme that will come up again and again, is seen as a new way to create a new identity, a new national identity. Okay. Currently, the North and the South during this time are trying to rectify things and become one country again. So, what does that national identity look like? African Americans, Asian Americans, a lot of people who were racially not able to be citizens before the 13th Amendment are now able to be citizens. So, what does that look like? What does that national identity look like? And what role, especially economically, will everyone play in this new nation? Okay, this is the goal of education at this point. Now, when we're talking about the goal of education for black and brown people specifically, there are two different schools of thought, and that just means two groups of people that are thinking a particular way. The first group of or the first school of thought is Washington, the Washington School of Thought. And this right here, this gentleman, this is Booker T. Washington. He is the figurehead, the champion of the Washington School of Thought. It's after him, right? He's the leader. The second one is led by Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and here he is right here on the bottom. All right. A lot of times when history teachers and when historians talk about these two men, they usually talk about them as if they were constantly fighting. And we do talk about them separate. And for the most part, they do have separate goals for education. But it's very important to note that they were not always in conflict. Okay. They supported each other, right? Especially financially. Booker T. Washington actually supported financially a lot of W.E.B. Du Bois's efforts, even though they were theoretically on opposite ends of a spectrum. Okay. Just because they didn't agree on how education was supposed to go didn't mean that they didn't think that education overall was super important. All right. So let's look a little bit more into that divide between Washington and Du Bois. So in your notes, you can just put educational divide and then just make a T-chart, right? Like you do in math. On one side of the T-chart, put Washington, the other side, put Du Bois. Now, Washington. In Washington School of Thought, reading and writing are not important. Okay. Manual labor is the most important thing for Washington and his followers. So if you were in Washington's kind of schools, they would be teaching you maybe basic reading and writing, but they didn't stress it heavily. And they would be teaching you that manual labor is the way to go in life. Like that's that's your job. That is your role as a black or a brown person, is to be a manual laborer. On the Du Bois side of things, reading and writing are super important. Okay. They also believed that black people should go to college and become well educated. All right. What's important to note is that Du Bois doesn't believe that's the case for everyone, right? He says that not everyone is capable of this, but there should be an educated elite that guide everyone else. Okay. So let's break that down a little bit further. Okay, continuing with your T-chart on the Washington side of things. Washington and his school of thought and his followers are funded and endorsed by a lot of state and local governments. Okay, your education right now is funded by state and local government. Okay, your school gets money from the state of California, it gets money from the federal government. Many of Washington's schools were funded by states, especially states in the South. They really wanted to fund Washington-style schools. They put not a lot of money, but they put money into them. They really did not put any money into any kind of Du Boisian school. Okay. In a Washington school, you were taught how to be either a low or non-skilled laborer. What does that mean? That means that you were learning how to do things like harvest crops. You were learning to do things like wash clothes. You were learning to do things like maybe if you were lucky, you would learn how to like lay bricks, like mason work, but that was very rare. They're really teaching you how to be more or less a servant, right? Either a farmhand or a maid or some other kind of like janitor. Okay. Students who came and went into Washington schools were barely literate, right? Literacy was not important. The important part was that you worked hard. So they could just barely read and write. Now, that's a good thing for contractors, people who are making money off of sharecroppers, landowners, because they can write the contracts, and the people they're writing the contracts for can barely understand what the contract is written or how the contract is written. Okay. This was not taken very well by the majority of African Americans. They did not want a Washington style education. Okay. But many people, many white people in particular, pushed for a Washington style of education. All right. They wanted African Americans to remain in a place of servitude, in positions and jobs that didn't really give them a lot of economic freedom and kept them in a place of subservience. Okay. It also meant that for white people, there wasn't any extra competition for high paying jobs from black people. All right. Now, Washington's style, Washington's model is also used to set the foundation for Native American education. And we'll get into that in just a moment. All right. Other side of your T chart, Du Bois. So, Du Bois, many of his schools are funded by religious organizations and philanthropists. By philanthropists, I mean rich people with money who are looking to spend money for a good cause. Okay. There was not a lot of state government or local governments or federal government that would fund a Du Bois style school. Okay. Many of these schools that were Du Boisian that were teaching what's known as a liberal arts degree, which is what you're getting right. You're getting a liberal arts education. Many of these were funded by sometimes churches, like single churches would just collect tithings to fund these schools to get supplies for teachers, blah, 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 sometimes even pay teachers. Other times it was by like big national church groups. If you were in a Du Boisian school, you were taught the importance of reading and writing. Okay. Everyone should be able to read and write without exception in a Du Boisian school. Just not everyone should be going to college. Okay. And for college, right here, they founded several historically black colleges. All right. These are also called HBCs. You'll hear about some of them. They're still around. And for many black people, until much, much later after Reconstruction, their only chance of going to college is to go to a historically black college because most standard colleges will not admit African Americans. Okay. So this will be the end of your T chart. Okay. So you should have Washington on one side, Du Bois on the other. Now I had mentioned right here that Washington style schools were this foundation for Native American education. And we're going to get into that. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a warning. The Native American education is a downer. Okay. It is not pleasant. So, warning there. So, Native Americans after the war. And that's what you can just put for this next heading, Native Americans after war. Remember, we had talked about how there were many tribes that had signed treaties with the Confederacy. Well, after the war, when the Confederacy loses, the federal government was like, dude, you signed a treaty with the Confederacy, and therefore the treaty we had before the war is over. Like, you need to negotiate a new treaty. So they did. Now, in these treaties, some land was taken, and some peoples, some other Native American tribes, were relocated into other Native American lands. Okay. All the tribes that had slaves had to release them. They also had to abolish slavery. There was to be no slavery at all in any form in the United States, except for prisoner labor, which we talked about last time. So the US, after the war, also decides, after they look at Washington's model, that they're going to try and follow a policy known as assimilation. Assimilation means to bring into, to make something else a part of the main body. So that's what they're going to do with Native Americans. And this is culturally, socially, horrendous. Okay, this is bad, right? So the whole premise of assimilation is Native American people have to abandon their own culture and their own identities and become part of US white culture, and white people will dictate all of the terms to them. Okay, they basically have to completely abandon everything that makes them so they can become subservient to the US population. All right, and education is how they're going to do this. All right, so boarding schools. This is still a hot topic issue because boarding schools were not closed until recently, and we'll get into that. But how the boarding schools work, if you were a Native American child living in the US, you would be sent to a boarding school, which means you would be taken from your family. And these are children at kindergarten age, so like 5, 6 years old. And you'd be sent to these boarding schools that are located hundreds of miles away from your home. So, I mean, just that alone, you're taken away from your family against your will because if your family did not surrender you to the government, then the government would arrest your family or they would withhold supplies that were guaranteed in a treaty. It was not a good option. Okay, so you were ripped apart from your family. You were sent hundreds of miles, a couple states away. All right. Once you got to the boarding school, you were completely stripped of your culture and your language. Okay. You were also forced to adopt white customs and Christianity. Okay, so if we look at this picture over here, we have some children as they are coming into a boarding school when they first arrive, and this is what they look like after arriving. Okay, now to try to put this into a comparison, this would be like a child from the US now who, say, only speaks English or only speaks Spanish or any of the other languages that are common here in California in the area, sorry. 5 years old, the police show up at your house, take the kid away. The child is then sent all the way over to, say, like Utah or Colorado, right? Hundreds of miles away, sometimes thousands of miles away. They arrive. They are forced to do things that go against their religious beliefs and their cultural beliefs and their customs. They're forced to completely change the way they look. They are no longer allowed to speak their own language. If you were in a boarding school as a Native American and you were caught or heard speaking your native language, you were punished. Sometimes punishment was like a verbal warning or something like that. Oftentimes punishment was corporal, meaning physical. You were physically punished. You were hit for speaking your native language. None of the teachers or the administrators who are at your school speak your language. They have no idea what you're saying, and you have no idea what they're saying. You don't speak the same language. But as a 5-year-old, the 5-year-old is expected to stop speaking their language and automatically pick up English. Right? And every time you don't speak English, you are punished. Okay? If you are caught doing your own religious practices, you are punished. If you do anything that is not white, you are punished. Okay? Do you remember in our lesson about slavery when we talked about how slavery created a pan identity by destroying Black people's cultural identities before being enslaved? Okay. This is essentially what boarding schools, which are run by the federal government, were trying to do to Native Americans. Okay. So these were bad. This is total trauma. They have kids that are running away constantly. There are well-documented cases of like letters sent home from these students about how horrible it is and how they want to try to get back home, and how poorly they're being treated. Okay. And again, there are cases where children, some of these kids as young as 5 years old, would escape and run away and travel hundreds of miles to get back home only to be caught again and sent back. Okay. It was not pleasant. It was not good. Not at all. Cannot stress that enough. So what was life other than that like in these boarding schools? So here is a boarding school. This is one that's in pretty good shape. Usually they were not in good shape because they were not well funded. But you can see students here, they are all wearing standard traditional white people clothes, and they are working in a garden out front. Okay. These schools were run on a Washington style educational model, which means that they're not really being taught how to read and write so much as they're being taught stuff like this, how to work. Okay. They are forced to work not just at the school, but on the school. So I mentioned that their schools were very poorly funded. Well, they were so poorly funded that most of the time, some of the bad cases, the schools were literally falling in on themselves. That's how bad they were. And it was students' responsibilities to do things like grow the food for for everyone to eat, to repair the school building when it got damaged, to maintain the grounds, to wash and clean all laundry, right? To sew and repair all broken clothes. Religion is very, very heavily pushed. So they force students to also attend church and to adopt Christian beliefs. Um, they are also kept from their families, right? Many of them are kept from their families, even on holidays. So not only are they taken from their families, they're not allowed to go back half the time. Okay. Um, Similar to the convict lease system, children were forced to work for schools and then were rented out to white families as laborers or servants. Now, the difference for this one is that they weren't technically prisoners, they were paid, but very, 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 very little. Again, like pennies on the dollar for their work. And sometimes that money, other times the school would take all that money. Okay. One of the worst parts about boarding school, though, is that a lot of students died. Um, so many of the students would die from disease and sickness. Okay. If you guys remember when you were learning about colonization, when white folks showed up on the continent, Native Americans did not have any natural protection to the diseases they carried. Well, this is still the case for these students at boarding schools. So, tuberculosis, TB, was a big one. TB wiped out a ton of kids in these boarding schools because they're all crammed together in one small building. Okay. It's not good, but still, the conditions on reservations were worse sometimes. So, parents kind of had no choice. All right. So, I don't want to keep getting into the dark and gloomy stuff. This is where I'm going to end this section. So you can go ahead and slash out along the bottom of your notes and just put in and today's date, and then we will pick up on the next topic next time.